Well, welcome everyone. I'd like to get started off here with our second session on advanced grazing, when we're going to be focusing on plants today. And of course, it's going to be a tag team presentation between myself and Lee Rinehart, my partner in crime. And we're really excited to get up to cover some of this information. We realized very quickly that as we were diving into this during the planning stages, that there's no way that we can possibly cover everything that we want to cover, but we're going to try to at least hit the highlights and hopefully be able to give you some really good and useful information that you can utilize on your own grazing operation. So I'm going to lead off today for the first half of the presentation, and then Lee will be coming in behind me and wrapping things up. Go ahead and go to the next slide there, Carlos. In getting started here, what I first wanted to kind of cover was what is disturbance. And in ecological terms, a disturbance is a temporary disruption in the environment that either results from natural or human activities that causes a pronounced change in an ecosystem. Now that's, a pretty dry and stale definition, but what I wanted to focus on that definition are actually two phrases. The first phrase is temporary disruption. And we know from just, observing, nature is that, there's a lot of disturbances that nature does that usually only lasts just a few seconds or maybe to a minute in one spot, so you can think of something like an earthquake or a fire. So those things, oftentimes only last a very short period of time. But then there's other disturbances that last a much longer period of time. They're prolonged. So, that's where we get into things like a severe drought or even overgrazing. So that can happen, occur for several months or even decades in the same spot. So if the disturbance is very brief and abrupt, these kinds of disturbances are what I call acute disturbances. So if you ever think about medical conditions, there's what are called acute medical conditions. And so they're usually very brief, they're very abrupt. And so that would be something like, if you were to cut yourself with a knife, or if you were to break an arm or a leg, that'd be something that'd be very painful, but it usually lasts for a very short period of time. And as long as there's a sufficient recovery time after that, then our bodies are usually pretty good at healing themselves from those kinds of disturbances. So in grazing, if you have livestock that are grazing for a day in one spot at a high stock density, that's what we probably consider an acute disturbance, so long as the livestock don't come back to the same spot until the soils and plants are fully recovered. So that's really key right there, so long as the animals don't come back until the soils and plants are recovered. Now, on the flip side, if the disturbance is prolonged and it occurs over a period of months to years, then this is the kind of disturbance that I'm going to call a chronic disturbance. And in medical terms, when we think about a chronic disturbance, that would be something like where we're continuously disturbing either our body or our mind by not allowing that cut or that broken arm to heal. As well as, you can get into chronic health issues if you start talking about things that we do to our bodies that could cause a chronic health issue. Some things that we oftentimes do is, we may not be eating the best, we may have poor eating habits, we may not be getting the type of physical activity that our bodies need, holding a grudge or being in a stressful situation that lasts weeks or months or even years. So this is the reason why chronic disturbances are so detrimental, is that the disturbance is ongoing. It's continuous, no recovery for our bodies and no recovery for the ecosystem. So if we have livestock grazing for weeks or even months on end in one spot at low stock densities, that would be just a perfect illustration of a chronic disturbance, because that disturbance of grazing just keeps going on. It never stops. And then because of that, there's just no recovery period for the soils and the plant. So the second thing I want to focus on in this definition is the phrase pronounced change in an ecosystem. So if you notice that the word change doesn't have the word positive or negative attached to it, and that really means that the disturbance can either be positive or negative depending on the nature of the disturbance. Next slide, please. So there are essentially 7 dimensions of disturbance. So real quickly, they start off with timing. So that's when the disturbance occurs. There's duration, which is how long that disturbance lasts. Frequency, which means how often a disturbance occurs over a specified time period. And then frequency, when combined with the dimension of duration, defines the length of the recovery period between the end of one disturbance and the beginning of the next one. Then we also have the dimension of intensity, which is the strength of the disturbance force or how big the disturbance is. Pattern, which is the level of patchiness or uniformity of a disturbance over an area. Then we also have size, which is the area of the disturbed patch, and then the scale, which would be like the combined area of all the disturbed patches in an area. Next slide. So for grazing lands, the primary disturbance comes in the form of the interaction between livestock and their landscapes for grazing, right? There's examples galore of landscapes degraded by uncontrolled or poorly managed grazing, but there are also examples of proper grazing management dramatically improving plant and soil health. So how could the disturbance of grazing yield such dramatically different outcomes? And the reason lies in the difference of the dimensions of timing, duration, frequency, and intensity. So those ones that you see actually in yellow print, those are influenced directly by grazing management. And it's those 4 dimensions that are the primary drivers for improving plant and soil health on grazing lands on a field-by-field basis. Next slide. As seen in the table above, grazing can be either an acute or chronic disturbance of management that we end up imposing through each of the 4 disturbance dimensions. So the interaction of these 4 dimensions is really what determines whether grazing will be a positive or a negative for the ecosystem. So let's go through each of these dimensions and see how they compare under 2 opposing styles of grazing management. On one end of the spectrum, we have grazing management that focuses on creating acute disturbances, as you see up there towards the top, where it says acute with say, a green cell. I'll call this style of grazing management recovery-based multi-paddock grazing. And the reason why I called it that is because what I'm trying to do, and we'll get into this more, is that good grazing management has to be recovery based. It has to make sure that plants are recovered before we go back in to that field or that paddock. So we want that full plant recovery, and we're going to use multiple paddocks in order to do that. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we have continuous grazing, and that's where grazing is just happening in one field, and it happens nearly continuously, which then results in that chronic disturbance of overgrazing. So I also include a third column here, which was the long-term grazing exclusion and overresting, and I place that under the umbrella of a chronic disturbance, because if plants are not periodically grazed or pruned, eventually the health and productivity of those plants begins to decline, where they die from the inside out. And the reason why this happens, folks, is because old leaves, if not removed, prevents new leaves from growing. And old leaves can't make carbohydrates because they aren't photosynthetically active like new leaves. So if new leaves can't be created, the plant slowly dies as those carbohydrate reserves stored in the crown are exhausted until nothing's left. Okay, so we're going to switch over here to the left side of this diagram, looking at these disturbance dimensions, and we're going to see how they differ depending on whether we're using more of a recovery-based multi-paddock grazing approach or whether we're using a continuous grazing approach. So for timing, this is the time of year when plants are accessible to livestock or when livestock show up in a particular field or paddock. And if we're under a recovery-based multi-paddock grazing approach, the timing when plants are accessible to livestock changes from year to year to promote plant diversity. So that's why you see it says variable in that cell where the recovery-based multi-paddock grazing and the timing meet. It says variable there. So if we're grazing a paddock or a field at the same time of year every year under continuous grazing, that's going to promote plant species simplification. So basically meaning that our diversity in our pasture starts to go down. And this is where those most palatable plants that we have diminish while the less palatable plants start to increase. Now let's move on to duration. So this is how long those plants are accessible to livestock or how long the animals stay in one field or paddock. So under a recovery-based multi-paddock grazing approach, the plants are accessible to livestock for relatively brief periods of time. And that could range anywhere from 5 days or so during soil plant growth down to mere hours under ultra-high stock density grazing. So the less time animals spend in the field or paddock, the less severely plants are grazed overall, which that can maintain making sure that we have adequate leaf area for the plants so it can continue photosynthesizing and start to regrow quickly, and also help to maintain the root biomass so that the plant can keep going after water and accessing nutrients with that association with soil life that we talked about in our session 1. So if we have more leaves remaining, that's going to do a number of other things for us. So that's going to help us to reduce soil temperatures when it's really hot out. It's going to help to reduce water loss through evaporation. It's going to maintain optimal temperatures for soil life, which are responsible for gathering those plant essential nutrients, and it's going to allow plants to continue growing. So those shorter grazing durations are also going to prevent livestock from staying in one area for too long while plants are growing rapidly. And then, if we look at continuous grazing, the plants are exposed to animals for a very long time, and that could go anywhere from weeks to several months. And then the plants are grazed, they continue to be grazed more severely which means they're being grazed down very low to the ground surface, which then causes the opposite effect of what the the recovery-based multi-paddock grazing approach would give us. So that's going to give us delayed plant growth. It's going to reduce root biomass, give us higher soil temperatures. We're going to lose more water to evaporation, and we're also going to have a reduced microbial activity because our soil temperatures are getting hotter because we have less cover. Next, we move on to the third disturbance dimension, which is frequency. And so under a recovery-based multi-paddock grazing approach, the frequency of grazing is going to be low because that's going to help to prevent grazing plants before they've recovered from the prior disturbance. So if we have continuous grazing in place, that frequency is actually going to be high because the animals, they're constantly there regrazing their favorite plants every 4 to 6 days during the growing season. So if we've got optimal temperatures, optimal precipitation or irrigation, the plants, because the animals aren't moving on to someplace else, they're not migrating away, they can still get access to the plant every 4 to 6 days. And so, they're just regrazing all that tender regrowth of their favorite plants. And eventually those plants end up leaving. Now we've got the final one, which is intensity. And this one is, intensity we talked about, that's really kind of the strength of the disturbance force. When we say something is intense, we're saying, whoa, that's a lot of force that's behind that. And in grazing, I'm actually kind of measuring this force through the metric of stock density. So stock density is simply where we take the weight of the herd divided by the acres that they have access to at any given point in time. And stock density essentially, focuses the weight of the animals, their hoof impact into one very small area for a very short period of time. And when stock density goes up, generally your grazing duration starts to shorten in that area because you're depleting the forage in a small area very quickly. It also increases the ability for livestock to be selective in what they choose to eat or not eat. That ability for them to be selective actually starts to decrease as stock density goes up. Also, the grazing uniformity increases. So we get more of an even utilization across the entire paddock when animals are grazing at higher stock densities. And dry matter intake can actually start to drop off at this point if it's done at very high stock densities with finishing class livestock. So that's something that we have to be kind of aware of, that if we're going to be using high stock densities, that the class of animals is very important in what we're doing that with, because animals that are in the finishing class realm really need to make sure that they have plenty of forage in front of them, that they can get all the food that they can possibly get and get fat. So if we have a herd of 100 beef animals that weigh 1,200 pounds each and they're on a 2-acre paddock, that would be 60,000 pounds live weight per acre. If that same herd had access to 20 acres at a time, then the stock density would be only 6,000 pounds live weight per acre. And then if we're using a recovery-based multi-paddock grazing approach, stock densities are usually moderate to high during the growing season, because graziers who use this approach usually subdivide their fields using temporary electric fence. And they divide it into, many variable sized paddocks to capture the benefits of higher stock densities. But under continuous grazing, the stock densities are actually quite low. Usually they're never more than 1,000 pounds live weight per acre. You'll see a few animals out there, they'll have this relatively large field, but the stock density is very low. The animals are not close together at all. They're spread out, they're scattered. Now, some of you may be wondering why I haven't given any hardline numerical values in this table, and that's because we're not all operating in the same environment and have the same plains. The United States is blessed with a tremendous variation in climate, in plants, in soils, in topography, and there's just no way that we can give hardline numbers for any of this stuff. But if we're in a dry environment, these disturbance dimensions are going to be at different values than they would be in more humid environments. And for that, we'll go to the next slide, which will then kind of dive into this just a little bit more. So for those of you that remember graphs better than tables, here's what we just talked about in graph form, with the addition of how things might differ depending on the humidity level in your environment. So we got this first disturbance dimension of timing right here. But whether we're in a low or a high humid environment, graziers who adopt a recovery-based multi-paddock grazing approach change that season of use when fields are being grazed. They're not going into the same field, field number 1 on, May 15th every single year. They're going to be changing things up, staggering things. With continuous grazing, changing season of use is not really even a consideration. But one thing I'd like to mention at this point is that if we're in a low humid environment like a desert, making sure that the timing variation is high by alternating season of use is probably even more critical than it is in a wetter or more humid environment. And this is because once a plant community in a dry environment has shifted to less desirable vegetation, it can often be super challenging, if not impossible, to get that desirable plant community back without using extensive and expensive inputs to do so. Next slide. So for the second disturbance dimension of duration, recovery-based multi-paddock grazing, whether we're in a low or high humid environment, uses a low grazing duration. So grazing duration is another way of saying grazing period. You know, how long are the animals in one spot? So what would be considered a low grazing duration? Generally speaking, we're looking at 3 days or less during periods of fast plant growth and 5 days or less during periods of slow plant growth. Continuous grazing, on the other hand, uses grazing durations that can last weeks or months, which then results in overgrazing from livestock spending too long in one spot while plants are growing. Next slide. For this third dimension of disturbance for frequency, recovery-based multi-paddock grazing, whether we're in a low or high humid environment, is going to be using that low grazing frequency. And the low grazing frequencies allow the plants to be fully recovered before they are grazed again. Because remember, we were talking about this as kind of a recovery-based multi-paddock grazing approach. So if we're going to make sure that plants are fully recovered before animals move in, generally that means that we're going to be monitoring for that, and usually we're going to have a lower grazing frequency. So this is going to prevent overgrazing from livestock moving away, but then coming back before the previously grazed plants have reached full recovery. And if we're in a low humidity environment like a desert, plants are going to need a year or considerably longer to fully recover, depending on when those rains come. And so in a desert, the grazing frequency may be at least once per year. And if the precipitation doesn't come at the right time, that grazing frequency could easily stretch into once every 2 years or even less frequent. It all depends on when the rains arrive. Now, if we're in a higher humidity environment, like the eastern half of the US, or if we're under irrigation, plants may only need 30 to 50 days to fully recover from the prior grazing event, which is why that green line where you see the recovery-based multi-paddock grazing at, that's why it's sloping upward as one moves from a drier environment to a more humid environment or irrigated environment. So under continuous grazing, since the animals remain in the same field for weeks or months, the previously grazed plants are constantly being bitten down as soon as a little bit of regrowth takes place, which then makes the grazing frequency high. Next slide. So for the final disturbance dimension of it, which is intensity, again, we're using the metric of stock density to measure that. As we transition from a low to a high humid environment, that stock density can go from a moderate level of, like, let's say 10 or 20,000 pounds live weight per acre to a very high level in the realms of 1 million pounds live weight per acre. So in very high stock density situations, the livestock may be moved every couple of hours. And I've seen that done. Stock densities that are under continuous grazing seldom exceed 1,000 pounds live weight per acre. So under recovery-based multi-paddock grazing approach, more forage is grown compared to continuous grazing because the plants aren't being overgrazed, right? And this allows the stock density to be several magnitudes higher for recovery-based multi-paddock grazing than continuous grazing at all humidity levels. Next slide. So one of the most important reasons for using a recovery-based multi-paddock grazing approach is for the impending catastrophes that eventually will come. So if that catastrophe arrives as a prolonged severe drought or a flood, our pastures need to be healthy enough to bounce back quickly once the catastrophe passes. So recovering quickly from difficult conditions really demonstrates the concept of resiliency. Next slide. So this graph here kind of represents our understanding of how pastures generally respond after a major disturbance or catastrophe. So we have pasture health on the left side of the diagram for the vertical axis going from low to high. And then we have time on the horizontal axis going from left to right. So we have two different pastures here. The pasture represented by the green line is the healthier pasture. And the pasture represented by the red line is the less healthy pasture. So as I was saying about before, we want our pastures to be resilient, okay? Being able to bounce back very quickly from a disturbance, and especially a catastrophic event. So the healthier our pastures are, the more resilient they become when a catastrophic event happens. Notice that that healthy pasture still does take a little bit of a hit, right? But it does not drop down. The bottom doesn't fall out from the bottom of the pasture because so much more resilience has been built into that pasture. You know, you usually have a higher level of organic carbon there. You've got more active soil biology. And you've got better soil aggregate structure, and all those are working for you so that pasture can actually, after it has dropped down and taken a hit from the catastrophic event, it actually bounces back up fairly quickly. So you would say, yeah, that is very resilient. Now, our pasture represented in red, which is not as healthy, we could say, if that's an overgrazed pasture, when that catastrophic event happens, notice that essentially the bottom just falls out from underneath of it. And so that health really declines even worse. And then what's more is it takes a much longer time period to get that pasture back to what it was before the catastrophic event happened. Next slide, please. This is kind of my take, using an analogy here a little bit on what most of us have experienced, which is flying in an airplane. And I kind of just want to make the analogy here that, our healthier pastures that are more resilient, it's like that plane that's flying at that higher altitude. And then our less healthy pastures are like that plane that's flying at the lower altitude. And then a catastrophe happens, okay? The plane has to land. And if the plane is only 1,000 feet off the ground and the plane has to land immediately, the pilot has just a matter of seconds to be able to make a very quick decision to figure out where to land that plane. And the pilot doesn't have very many options as far as where to set the plane down, because you're going slower and you're only 1,000 feet up in the air. And that's very much like, if we have pastures that have been overgrazed and then a catastrophe happens, all of a sudden the rain shut off, we have to act very quickly and we don't have a lot of options. Time is running out. Compared to that plane that's flying at 35,000 feet doing 640 miles an hour, if something happens, that pilot has a lot more time and a lot more options to choose from as far as where to set that plane, which is very similar to in our grazing operations. The healthier our pastures are, the more resilience that's built into them. When the catastrophe strikes, we've got options and we've got time to be able to make a good decision on where we can go next with our livestock. We don't have to necessarily be operating in panic mode. Next slide. So our primary goal in grazing is really, and really any farming endeavor, is to efficiently and properly convert light energy from sun into food. This process of photosynthesis, it's something that we probably all learned about in grade school. And it's really easy to take it for granted because it just seems so simple, right? You got sunlight, you got carbon dioxide and water, and when you get those three combined, you get glucose and you get oxygen. And to tell you the truth, I've taken it for granted a lot, but realizing that, you know what, as graziers, we can actually improve photosynthesis beyond what it probably is right now. Now, this may come as a little bit of a revelation to you. It definitely came as a revelation to me. And what I want to focus on, next slide, what I want to focus on here is what I circled in that round circle there is CO2. You know, we can't change the amount of sunlight we're receiving. We can modify the water a bit depending on our practices and if we're using irrigation. But the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere, you know, we've got roughly about 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But what's interesting is that by mid-morning, the concentration of CO2 around the leaves of plants can drop down to about 100 parts per million. And what that means is that, you know, actually what's limiting photosynthesis is it may not be water, it may not be sunlight, but it actually may be CO2. Well, how in the world do you change CO2 concentrations around a plant leaf? Let's dive into that just a little bit. Next slide. So one of the first keys to answering that question is realizing that carbon dioxide comes from a lot of different sources. You know, some of it comes from us and animals exhaling. Some of it comes from decomposing organic matter. Some of it comes from burning organic matter. And some of it comes from oxygen-dependent aerobic soil organisms that are exhaling just like we do. So the concentration of carbon dioxide in a healthy soil, it can be in the realms of 10,000 parts per million, which is way, way, way more than 420 parts per million. So in our first session, you know, we talked about what soil life do, and that soil life, they are fed from plant roots because they can't make their own food like a plant can. So they depend on plant roots to get organic acids, amino acids, enzymes, sugars, phenolic acids, and other compounds. But the question that I had as I was going along in my learning process was, do plants release or exude the same amount of these compounds all the time? You know, do they release the same amount of sugars and amino acids to the soil life, you know, no matter what their growth phase is? And if they don't, then how does that change? And can the amount of these compounds be enhanced through our management? Next slide, please. So I did a little bit of digging, and after spending a considerable time going through a lot of journal articles on the subject and typing in a lot of search terms, I came across this piece of research that answered some of these questions. So this is actually data that was done from a study looking at rice. And rice is an annual warm season grass. But here it shows 3 different rice varieties at 4 different growth phases. So seedling, panicle, initiation, flowering, and maturity. The seedling stage would be analogous to the vegetative growth phase, or phase 1. The panicle initiation stage would be analogous to the elongation growth phase, or phase 2. The flowering stage would be analogous to the early reproductive growth phase, or early phase 3. And then the maturity stage, that would be comparable to the late reproductive growth phase, or late phase 3. Now, on that vertical axis, what they're measuring is the total organic carbon that's coming out of the roots, that's being released by plant roots. So you've got all these organic carbon-containing compounds that are being released to soil life. So the research, as you're seeing here, show that not only do plant root exudates change with grass growth phase, but they follow an interesting pattern. This pattern shows that in most cases, the root exudates are lowest in the seedling phase. Then they increase through the panicle initiation phase, peak out in the flowering phase, and they finally decrease in the maturity phase. So how does this relate to increasing carbon dioxide around plant leaves so that it can increase photosynthesis. Well, as the quantity of organic carbon being released in the soil increases, that's feeding, that is food for soil life, so that they can gather plant nutrients and they can also multiply. Well, if you start increasing populations of these critters in the soil, guess what happens? They're breathing in more oxygen and they're exhaling more carbon dioxide. So that's going to start increasing the CO2 levels in the soil. And since carbon dioxide is heavier than air, guess what? It starts to build and build and build and actually starts coming out of the soil. It rises out of the soil and it comes out of the pores in the soil surface, and then it is actually taken in by the pores on the underside of the leaves of the plant. And what that does is that just turbocharges or enhances photosynthesis. So the take-home message here for our grazing management is this: the first step to increasing photosynthesis and overall forage production is to allow plants to reach at least the elongation growth phase or the early reproductive growth phase. And it's in these growth phases where the total organic carbon being released by plant roots is maximized, which triggers a soil microbial population explosion, which triggers greater carbon dioxide production and eventually an increase in photosynthesis. Next slide. Next, I wanted to know how grazing severity influenced the quantity of organic compounds that are coming off of plant roots. So I did a little bit more digging, and this research here looked at the effect of grazing severity on root exudation for plants in an alpine meadow. They did 3 levels of grazing severity where they had a no grazing control, moderate, and what they call heavy grazing, which would be the same thing as severe grazing. So they found, as you can see from this chart, is that heavy or severe grazing significantly decreased root exudation during grazing, and it somewhat decreased root exudation after a 21-day recovery period. The other thing I noticed here is that after that 21-day recovery period, moderate grazing enhanced root exudation beyond the no graze control. So that just kind of goes to show that, you know, the pasture, the plants need animals, and we can actually take we can improve upon the population of biology that's in the soil by having animals grazing it. So the take-home message for our grazing management from this is that that second step to increasing root exudation, which is going to trigger higher rates of photosynthesis, and also if our photosynthesis is getting kicked into overdrive, guess what our forage production is doing? Our forage production is doing the same thing. It's also increasing, and that means we need to be looking at grazing at moderate levels of severity. So if we graze severely or heavy, as we see here, then we're going to get significantly lower levels of root exudation and eventually lower levels of photosynthesis. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to have to really pick up the pace here as I'm going through these next slides. So just be assured that this is being recorded, and we will be sharing these slides with the participants, and our notes that are with this are going to be included like with that as it was in session 1. So real quickly, we know that, okay, overgrazing, and we'll talk just very briefly about what that is, but overgrazing impacts plant roots tremendously. And you know, when they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, this one does the trick. Where we see where tall fescue, kind of there towards the middle of the picture there, where that was overgrazed, and you look at what's happening to the roots, most importantly. So what you see above ground oftentimes is kind of a mirror image of what's going on below ground. Next slide. So this is probably the most famous study that was done looking at root response to different levels of top reduction, which is just a fancy word for saying, you know, what percentage of the above ground material was actually removed from grazing. And so we see that, you know, once you can remove up to about, 50% or so, you get maybe about a 2% reduction on the roots. by day 3, and then the roots, the roots don't stop growing. But once you crest over 50%, now you're getting the 60, 70, 80%. More and more of those roots actually stop growing. And when you're getting into 80 and 90% of what's being removed, you're actually shutting down root growth for anywhere from a week and a half to over 2 weeks. Next slide. So when we say overgrazing, simply what it is that you're grazing a plant before it's ready to be grazed, right? That's the simple definition of it. Next slide. And that's really a chronic plant and soil disturbance. Next slide. So there's 3 ways to overgraze. Really quickly, it's where animals remain in one area too long when plants are growing rapidly. It's where animals leave, but then they come back too quickly when plants are growing slowly. And it's also when plants are grazed too soon after dormancy or catastrophic disturbance like a drought, fire, flood, insects, or hail. Next slide. And the key part here with overgrazing is that it means that it's happening during the growing season. You can't overgraze a plant during the winter time. Now you can severely graze a plant down during the winter time. The plant can get nubbed down very, very tight, but that's not the same as overgrazing. Overgrazing implies that the plant is trying to regrow. Next slide, please. So here, real quickly, we have our grass development phases. So our first phase is the vegetative phase, and this is the phase that, as I drive around my area, this is the phase that I mostly see animals eating, is the vegetative phase. And if you look at the graph on the right and you look at that green line, in phase 1, that green line is not very, it's fairly flat. It's not as steep as it could be like in phase 2. And the steepness of that green line just means how fast plants are growing. So in the vegetative phase, plants are growing actually pretty slow. And it isn't until the next phase that they start to actually pick that up. Next slide. So in the vegetative phase, when animals graze plants in that phase, what does it do on the plant side? Well, what it does is it increases the recovery time for those plants. It decreases the overall pasture yield, and from what we just learned a couple minutes ago, it actually decreases the root mass and the root exudates that are coming out. Next slide. So in phase 2, this is where growth actually starts to pick up, and this is a phase where you actually have a stem being developed and what we call the elongation phase. So that plant is trying to produce a seed head, and the initial part of that seed head is still down at the base of the plant, and it's creating stems to support that future seed head. And it's at this point where the plants are growing at the fastest rate. Next slide. So what can happen when livestock graze pastures in that elongation phase? Well, what it does from the plant side is it actually helps to reduce recovery time, increase pasture yield, and it also helps to maximize root mass and root exudates. Next slide. So phase 3 is the phase where we actually have a seed head starting to emerge. And this is where, as you can see from the green line, plant growth is slowing down. That green curve is starting to flatten out as the plant, develops a seed head. Next slide. So in that reproductive phase, when those plants are grazed at that point in time, it can actually increase the recovery time because oftentimes that stuff gets trampled down, and then you're reliant on new plant generation, new buds at the bottom, new tillers being developed in order to get new growth taking place. It can actually decrease the pasture yield because if you're always grazing in phase 3 all the time, then oftentimes, when you add up the total yield that you're going to get, you may only get 2 grazings on it a year compared to maybe 3 or 4, depending on your environment, if you're grazing it more in phase 2. Your root mass can actually still continue to increase at phase 3. In the early phases of phase 3, you can actually have a very high level of root exudation. But once you get to late phase 3, then those root exudation from what we saw previously actually starts to drop off. Next slide, please. So when should livestock arrive? Look at that red square right there. So we're really looking at that latter half of phase 2, early phase 3. That's really kind of the best time from the plant standpoint. And I would also say also from an animal standpoint, that can be a very balanced meal for the animals. And we'll get more into that in the next session. Next slide. So here we have, when we're looking at when animals should arrive, just follow the arrows and look at the thumbs up and the thumbs down. So on the left, if animals are arriving in that late phase 2, but then they're kept there all the way down to somewhere in phase 1, it takes a very long time for those plants to recover back to a phase 2. Whereas where we have animals staying in that phase 2, when they arrive at the top and then they're leaving at the bottom of phase 2, it doesn't take very long for those plants to recover. Next slide. Okay, so when can livestock return? And the answer is only when plants are recovered. But how do we determine plant recovery? So here's some quick ones for you. Plants that are regrown to at least the top of the elongation growth phase, phase 2 or later. Next slide. No evidence of previous grazing, such as chewed leaf tips. Next slide. You want them to be as dark green as possible. Next slide. This picture here actually shows drone imagery looking at the greenness of a pasture. There's actually some pretty fancy subscription-based satellite software that you can use that on large-scale operations that can actually determine plant recovery using greenness indices to actually determine when the pasture is ready to be regrazed. And they'll base that purely off of, or part of it off of the green color. Next slide. And then finally, oldest leaves attached at the bottom are turning brown. And that's because, a plant will only grow so many leaves. And if it starts to push out another leaf out the top, it will actually start pulling carbohydrates from the lowest leaves, the oldest leaves, and reallocate those carbohydrates to the top of the plant. So those lowest leaves will actually start turning brown at the very edge. Next slide, please. So just a real brief note here on fall, winter grazing management. So fall's the beginning of the perennial cool season grass cycle. And this is when the first generation of roots and new growing points develop. Next slide. So this in grasses, the energy reserves are stored primarily above ground in the stem bases. Next slide. And then in taprooted broadleaves, those energy reserves are stored primarily below ground, such as like in alfalfa and other deep-rooted forbs. Next slide. So if you give animals the opportunity to, they will severely graze in the fall, because what they do is they sense that as the sugars are dropping down into the crown of the plant, the animals can sense that the sweetness is starting to get more and more concentrated. The more severely they graze into the plant. Next slide. So we want to leave at least a 4-inch stubble on cool season grasses and an 8-inch stubble on warm season grasses, whether we are in the fall or in the winter. We don't want to slick it down, because we could actually sacrifice plants. We could actually cause plant mortality. If not the very least, we're going to greatly delay plant growth the following spring. Next slide. And this is where stockpiling pasture and proper stocking rate really come into play to prevent grazing too low. Next slide. So just to wrap up here, some grazing guidelines. We want to begin grazing in late phase 2 or early phase 3. Next slide. We want to stop grazing at the bottom of phase 2 or earlier. We want to leave at least 50% so that the plant can continue to photosynthesize and recover. Next slide. We want to create enough paddocks per herd for a 3-day graze period during fast growth and a 5-day graze period during slow growth. Next slide. We want to monitor our pasture growth rates to adjust how fast or slow livestock moves through the rotation. Next slide. We don't want to bring animals back until the pasture has fully recovered. Next slide. And if no pasture is fully recovered before the second graze, we need to move livestock to one area and then feed hay there until the recovery does take place. Next slide. We want to maintain sufficient leaf area in the fall to enhance next year's production. And finally, next slide, we want to fluctuate our grazing timing, duration, frequency, and intensity throughout the year. And for that, I am totally out of time. I'm going to have to turn it quickly over to Lee, and we'll handle questions later on.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks a lot, Justin. I appreciate it. There's so much to talk about, and we could probably do 7 or 8 or 10 sessions, right? But the good thing is, like you mentioned, we do send out the slides and the notes along with resource lists, and then of course we're open to having telephone and email conversations just to kind of get comments and talk about things that are going on and continue all of our learning. So that's definitely something that we can continue to do. So thanks for that. And I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about weeds. We've been talking about the plant side and just starting off with disturbance, and that really does kind of lead into this talk about weeds. I often like to ask the question, well, do you really have a weed problem? Sometimes it's just a matter of perception, right? Not to say that weeds, especially noxious weeds, can cause an awful lot of problems economically and can do some damage with respect to the ecologies, but there's ways that we've learned to deal with it. And so we're going to talk about some of those things today. So you'll remember in our discussion from the last session that we had 2 weeks ago, we talked about plant succession. We talked about nature tending toward a sort of stability that can be altered and is altered through disturbance, right? So when a plant or a soil community is disturbed, it often wants to seek equilibrium. And in this seeking of equilibrium, weeds are often the pioneer species in succession. It's the first thing that kind of starts to come back whenever we give them a niche, right? Plant diversity tends to serve as a check when the system is disturbed. So that's why we've always been saying that the more diverse your pastures are, the better you're able to deal with weeds, because that diversity serves as a check because they're occupying more of those niches. Complex systems really occupy all the available space above and below ground and utilize the nutrients and the water from more of the soil profile. And complex systems, more diverse systems, are also more resilient from year to year, as some species thrive during wet times and other species thrive during drier times. And so you've got the seed bank, and you've got these plants, perennial plants, that are established in there, and they'll come on whenever they can. But simple systems such as monoculture pastures, on the other hand, are less resilient and are more prone to disease and insect attack because of the absence of that diversity. In those type of systems, 1 or 2 species prevail, and there's fewer niches for the beneficial organisms, including soil microorganisms. Remember in the first session, we talked about how microorganisms are associated with different and various plants, and that the more plants we have, the more microorganisms we have. Simple systems also exploit only a single layer of the soil due to a kind of a uniform root depth. And so you can think of Kentucky bluegrass here, right? You've pulled up a Kentucky bluegrass, and it's always very short fibrous root system. And if all you have is that, you're not accessing much of the soil, and you're not very drought tolerant. So nature wants to fill all these niches. And so when we leave a gap, so whether it's due to overgrazing or any other kind of disturbance that leaves the soil bare, nature wants to fill that gap with an opportunistic, adaptable plants, and these we call weeds. And so what you can think of, this is plant succession in action. You got pioneer species coming in, right? So this is what we're trying to manage. So Dave Pratt, and most of you may know who Dave Pratt is. He has once said that no one ever went broke because they had weeds. Weeds aren't a problem, they're a symptom. They tell us that something's out of whack with our land, and killing the weeds will not put things right. And he's correct there. I think, what I do is I think of plant succession whenever I see those words out of whack, when something is out of whack. Plant succession is happening. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is what the land is doing to heal itself and to move it along in plant succession. Okay, Carlos, next slide, please. So many plants that are considered to be pasture weeds, we know, are highly palatable and they're nutritious. And we're going to talk more about that coming up, but especially during the vegetative stage. Take, for instance, common weeds that we all have in our pastures and yards, dandelion and plantain. Both can be numerous in our pastures. And a lot of times producers spend thousands of dollars spraying them with herbicides. But however, they are valuable plants that occupy different root zones and deliver nutrients from various and different soil depths. They can also be nutritious and palatable and contain secondary and tertiary chemicals that act as natural medicines and dewormers. These and many other weeds can be valuable contributors to pastures, and with skilled management, we can actually use them. Even the so-called noxious weeds like knapweed and kochia can be grazed by cattle, sheep, or goats. Next slide, please. So this is a cool table that I got out of Acres USA, December 1999. Jerry Bernetti put this together from an article called Weeds, Forage, Fodder, and Medicine. And I love this. This is just one of two tables, and I will be sending this table to everyone on the participant list. So you will get this so you can kind of look at it in detail. But the plants listed here from the article are from northeastern Pennsylvania, actually close to where I live, and are compared with alfalfa. And most of the plants that are compared show increased protein as well as increased essential nutrients, which are really important for animal endocrine system function, immune system health, gut health, reproductive function. These are really important. And sometimes if we have a pasture that's not very diverse, we're not getting all those nutrients, and we have to supply minerals. I know many farmers and ranchers who do not feed minerals because their pastures are so diverse. In addition to these nutritional and medicinal benefits that these plants offer, they also break up hardpan in the soil. They remove excess nutrients from the soil. They provide pollen and nectar sources. They're food for birds and mammals. They're really cool. And we're going to just kind of go into how cool they can be. Richard Teague and Fred Provenza wrote a paper one time. Richard Teague is a rangeland grazing management professor, and Fred Provenza, you might know, is an animal behaviorist, and from Utah State. And they talk about how grazing management, how we manage the animals, right, influences what the animals learn. Continuous grazing at low stock densities encourages selective foraging, like Justin was saying, whereas management intensive or short duration high intensity grazing at a high stock density encourages animals to learn to mix their diets. All right. So a lot of people ask me, how do you teach animals to eat weeds? Well, this is one way to do it. Justin said that grazing selectivity goes down. They start to learn to eat more things. They start to become adapted to other plants. The relationship between learning and diet mixing in this management plays a critical role. So herbivores like cattle and sheep and goat, they learn to optimize their intake of foods in a manner that is consistent with their previous experiences with the foods that they have been given, right? So when they learn to eat only a small subset of more palatable plants, like nothing but annual ryegrass as far as you can see, which is kind of what I thought a pasture should look like 12 years ago, but I was totally wrong. They provide, when they learn to eat that small subset, they provide adequate nutrition, but animals are unlikely to learn about the possible benefits of mixing those different foods, especially those that are high in those secondary compounds. So the bottom line is animals can learn to eat weeds. Go to the next slide, please. So weed control for grazing. How do we use grazing for weed control? There's a lot. There's a lot you can do on your farm and ranch to control weeds through grazing. And control means either, grazing the plant or grazing around the plant. Sometimes we can't graze it, right? Because it's at a stage of its life that it's unpalatable. It has thorns, it's sticky, it's got toxins, it's got alkaloids, it's got terpenes. It just doesn't taste good, right? So adaptation means different things for different situations and for different weeds. Weed control through grazing could mean focusing on increasing competition with a dense stand of grass and other forbs, and as we do, it's just increasing plant competition. It could mean delay in spring grazing so that you could let the favorable forages establish well, right? It could mean beginning grazing early in the spring if you need to take advantage of palatable young weeds and annuals, like cheatgrass, for one thing. Really comes on, it's an annual, its own. There's not much of it, but it's really only edible whenever it's vegetative. And you can get animals on there, take that off, and then give room for the cool season perennials and the other perennial grasses to come on. It could mean even deferring grazing until the fall, just whatever works on your place. Next slide, please. It could mean leaving enough residual in the field in the fall to prevent light from getting to early spring germinating seeds. And this especially works with biennials like thistles and knapweeds and mustards and things. We've talked a lot about the saying, take half, leave half. So this principle, works really well for forage plant health, but it also works with respect to weed control. If this principle is followed, there will be enough residual organic matter left on the soil surface after grazing to keep the soil food web that supports all production running at a sustainable level. Leaf area for solar capture, soil armor, temperature, moisture, root senescence, and contribution of soil organic matter to feed those microorganisms. But if you're grazing too short, you're badly hurting the recovery time and reducing the amount of residue that's left on that paddock, and especially in the off season. Residual carbon above and below ground feeds all these soil microorganisms, and it protects the soil from moisture loss, and it encourages aggregation and all that cool stuff, but it also serves as a weed barrier too. This graph that I have up here, so I got this out of a paper from Texas A&M talking about residual vegetation and how it adds soil organic matter to the soil, which in time improves soil structure and holds water and reduces evaporation. However, one of the most important benefits of leaving residual forage on the soil is the boost it gives to forage production in subsequent years. So you can look here and see that in subsequent years, residual forage in pounds per acre, you can see that for the forage produced, 2,000 pounds of forage produced, you have, with the precipitation that you have the amount of forage that's left ungrazed determines next year's forage production. So they say here the most important thing is not how much rain you get, but how effective the soil moisture is for the future plant growth. Let's go on to the next one and onto the next slide and look a little bit deeper into residual. So this is really cool. Linda Poole, my colleague in Montana, who is actually with us today, sent me this picture and a little explanation. I thought it was amazing for this. This is her place. It's a good example of using the principle of maintaining residual, especially during the dormant season. Taking too much forage off during the dormant season can sometimes be deadly, but it's because it's tempting, right? It's tempting to leave grass in a field, especially whenever you're in a drought, like she and many ranchers and farmers and grazers are in the West right now, right? So the rains don't come, you're tempted to eat that grass like you see on the right side of the screen, right? But Linda taught me a maxim whenever she sent me this. She said, you can pay me now or you can pay me a lot later. And this has a lot in common with grass growth and use during the dry years. Saving that grass and leaving some of that dormant, not grazing it, instead feeding hay or something like that, and keeping that soil armor, keeping that that residual really does affect grass growth in the subsequent year, but it also affects weed pressure in the subsequent year. Um, Last year, Linda got about a third of her average annual precipitation. And this year, she says it's significantly worse. In this fence line contrast, this was taken on May 9th, and Linda's place is on the right side of the fence. She has said that careful management over 15 years can buffer the effects of devastating drought. But I mean, it's not enough because they're still in a drought. But you can see right there what leaving enough soil armor on the ground does. And that drastic fence line contrast right there. So thanks, Linda, for sending that to us, because that really clearly shows the benefit of leaving residual and watching your stubble height. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, we're going to skip that one and go to the next one. Okay, so we're going to continue on with grazing for weed control. What else could grazing for weed control look like? It could mean, as we've seen, as we've kind of talked about, actually targeting those weeds for grazing. Things like dock thistle, knapweeds, goldenrod. I've grazed heifers on fields that it seemed like it was half curly dock and they stripped it off, right? It was a matter of impact. It was a matter of stocking density, right? That's what did it, because they're all nutritious and they're palatable when they're vegetative. It's even true that high intensity, low frequency grazing can reduce Canada thistle shoot density and biomass and flowering. And 2 to 3 years of treatment can actually bring that under control. You know, some of these biennials that are really noxious for us, you know, it can really bring it under control within about a 3-year period of time. But this all depends upon the life cycle of the weed, whether it's annual, biennial, perennial, if it's upright growth or prostate growth, when it's at seed, you know, when is it palatable, those types of things. And it requires an awful lot of like observation and just getting to know what weeds are in your pasture, right? So I'm going to be sending you guys a resource list with all kinds of really cool weed ID guides in it. So you're going to get that in the mail too. One of the things also, if it's palatable at a certain stage, and if it's poisonous, which we're going to talk about next. But basically the idea is to plan and prevent weeds. Remember, bare ground is an invitation to weeds. Low residual afterwards is an invitation to weeds. And those short recovery periods, they do so much damage to the subsequent regrowth, but it's also an invitation to weeds. So everything that we're talking about and that Justin was talking about with respect to like proper grazing management and you know, grazing period and recovery period, it also impacts weed pressure on the farms. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, so we know that all plants have toxins, right? It's just a matter of how much they eat. Animals have nutritional wisdom, and we know this. I mean, read Fred Provenza. He's got some really good work out on that. And my cat wants to go out, and you can't go out. So sorry. So you're gonna have to deal with some meowing. So the thing is they have nutritional wisdom, and they get satiated from eating one type of a plant with certain secondary and tertiary chemicals, and then they move on to another one. Generally, usually animals know if a plant is good to eat due to a feedback mechanism that they get from the gut to the brain, right? It could be nausea, whatever, right? You know, we look at like when I was in Montana working with the Sheep Institute, and we put sheep on leafy spurge, right? They would eat the spurge to satiety for the half of the day and then go and start eating stuff like, you know, crested wheatgrass or whatever else was growing in the field. And we knew this from observation and from the transects and exclosures that we were doing, right? So it really showed that animals do have nutritional wisdom. They eat to satiety and then they move to another plant. And whenever after they move to another plant, and they're satiated there, they can move back, because the reason they're going after these poisonous plants is because they have good things in them. That's why they eat them. They've got those secondary chemicals that they want. Sometimes they have too much though of a bad chemical. So animals naturally learn what is good to eat, and they teach their calves through this grazing behavior, but they can also teach the other adults as well. So, you know, plants have these secondary and tertiary chemicals that can reduce the effects of the previous ingestion of toxic chemicals. That's why they're going back and forth. Take a look at that graph that I have up there. This this one I got from Kathy Voth's on Pasture. online magazine, right? And if you haven't subscribed to that, it is really worth it. It's a good source of information. But here's a study that was done looking at animals eating larkspur as a percent of their diet. And throughout the course of a month, you can see them going up and down, up and down. The first day they eat a little, the second day a little, they don't eat any the next. Then they're eating 20% the third day. Then they're off it. Then they're eating 40% the next day. Then they're off it. So the reason they're doing this is because they keep going back to these poisonous plants because it contains those secondary and tertiary chemicals that they know their body needs. They just can't eat much of it. So they're dosing themselves is what they're doing. Right. And the same goes with all the other types of weeds and plants that are in our fields. They will get some of those too and treat them the same way. We need to have it's a reason why we need to have such a diverse a variety of plants in our pastures. Right. So what if an animal does not experience that feedback and they overeat, right? And we can lose animals this way, right? So what do? Well, some of the things we can do, of course, is we can provide alternate foods in the pasture. As I said, diversity. Try to keep that pasture as diverse as possible. Always allow access to really good, fresh, high quality, clean water in an accessible site, especially in pastures where you know there's toxic plants. You can allow the grazing to occur only during specific times of the year when poisonous plants are more palatable, right? So this is going to require research and observation on your part. So many plants that are out there, and we know so little about the chemical profile of a lot of them and the effects that they have. Another thing we can do is we can introduce livestock to infested pastures very slowly and only with full guts. It's another thing we can do. So there's ways that we can deal with this, but I think, some of those things like alternate foods and diversity is really a good way to keep it going. So let's go ahead and switch our next slide. And my goal is to try to finish up by 7:30 because that's when we go. But you know what? If I'm not done, I might just keep going because we're recording this and I'd like to have this available, so whenever we come back and we can look at it again. And if you have to get off at 7:30, that's just fine. No problem here. You will be receiving all of the resources in the mail. So I'm just going to keep pushing on. So having covered plant diversity and especially how to deal with weeds through grazing, let's dig a little bit into how do you develop this system? How do you physically set up this system where you control animal grazing in a multi-paddock system such that you can control the grazing period and especially the amount of time it takes for the plants to recover, giving them enough time. So let's dig into that. And we've covered some of these concepts in the past session, and certainly Justin has talked about the underlying concepts here early in this session, right? We know that animal impact can alter plant succession and maintain that system in a specific cereal stage, and it can foster that plant diversity and nutrient cycling. So how do we set this up? Well, first of all, if we set it up by having an understanding of how much forage we have out there, what's our forage yield? And then also by matching that forage after we have that forage yield, matching it to the needs of the livestock that we're grazing. It's a two-step dance. It's really simple. It's that simple. But that's where the simplicity ends, because from there it's observation, it's implementation, it's adaptation. As the season progresses and as things happen, as fences break and as drought happens and things, we have to be able to adapt, right? So let's go to the next slide, please, Carlos. Thank you. So let's look at forage yield a little bit. For determining how much forage you out there should be a system that is easy to use for you, right? If it's not easy, you're probably not going to do it. If it's not something you can go out there and gives you meaningful information, it's not going to, you're probably not going to do it. So, think of something that's easy to use and simple. It's going to give you reliable information, right? So what you're going to do with this is whatever method you use of calculating how much forage you have, you want to be able to calibrate your eye to the landscape so that your future assessments will be more reliable. You can go out and look at the field and say, oh yeah, I know I've got about 2,000 pounds per acre there. That might be just enough that you need for your particular situation. But first you got to calibrate your eye. You need to determine your pasture productivity, as this will provide a baseline of information that's going to make that you're going to make all your management decisions based on, especially essentially the stocking density of those pastures. So you can determine forage yield with a pasture ruler, and that's just what it is. It's a ruler calibrated in inches, placed on end at ground level with forage height measured in inches, and you measure the height of the forage. You multiply the height of the pounds height by the pounds of forage per inch, as depicted, say, in this table that I got out of Southern Forages, which is an amazing, I don't know if you guys can see it. Am I on? That's it right there. It's a great book. Southern Forages got that great table in it. And so you can multiply that height by the pounds of forage per inch in order to come up with your with a good estimate. For dense productive pastures, you can use the highest value in the range, and for pastures with low productivity or bare spots, you can lose the lowest value of the range. You see, there's some subjectivity here. You can use a rising plate meter. This measures density as well as height. That's the one here on the right-hand picture. It's a 20 by 20 plate. It weighs about 2.5 pounds or so. It's dropped on a rule at waist level in order to get a density measure. And so this was developed in Iowa and in Missouri. And so where each inch of forage equals about 263 pounds per acre of dry matter. And so they verified this through various studies and clip and weigh stuff, but it should be calibrated for your own local use if you choose to use something like this. And an easy quick Google search will show you where you can get and how to use these. They're pretty simple to use, and some people like them. You can also get estimates from historic hay yields, and that can work sometimes if you got 2,000 pounds or 5,000 pounds in a cutting. That could be, let's just say it was in 30 days, that could be a grazing rotation. So you can kind of go from there. And finally, there's a clip and weigh, right? You can actually clip and weigh. And this is the one that I recommend at least once. And this is the one that can really calibrate your eye, because there's nothing better than getting down on your hands and knees and seeing what's actually going on in the property. I'm telling you. So with this, you'll need a gram scale and a hoop. You can get those readily from vendors online and such. You construct a square frame or a cable hoop, and those dimensions will be sent to you. I'm going to send those to you in the notes, so you guys can have the dimensions for this to make a hoop or a cable. And you randomly throw it on the ground, clip all the plants to ground level, and repeat that, like 9 or 10 times. Average that, weigh your samples in grams, and in a microwave, and then weigh them again after you have dehydrated them, and you'll come up with a % dry matter, right? And then you can weigh them, multiply that by 50. That dry matter weight in grams by 50 to get pounds per acre. Again, all of these instructions will be coming in your packet tomorrow. So it's also in our publication, Pasture, Rangeland, and Grazing Management. So it's all available there if a clip and weigh is something that you're interested in. But again, what it's going to do is it's going to calibrate your eye. So let's go to the next slide, please. Did we go to the next slide, please? There it is. Okay. Cool. So once you know the pasture lead, 2 questions that'll immediately come to up whenever you're thinking about adaptive multi-paddock grazing are, what size should my paddock be? And then after that, it's like, how many should I have? And I should say that that's probably the least important question. The most important question is, what size should the initial paddock be? So in order to best describe how to come up with this answer, let's try an example. So the easiest method is to consider the total live weight of the herd or the flock. Because I used to like try to figure out like what's the individual, needs, and then, but it's like, just add up all the animals, get the weight, figure out what the total weight is, and then match that to the forage yield estimate in your paddocks. So how do we match these up? Next slide, please. So the way we do that, let's assume that we have 50 cows. We got 50 cows and they each weigh about 1,100 pounds each. So the total weight of all the animals in a herd is 55,000 pounds. At a dry matter intake of about 3% of the animal's body weight, we know that our daily herd dry matter intake requirement for these cattle is 1,650 pounds. That's 55,000 times 0.03. Right. So if we have 3,000 pounds of forage per acre based on 10 inches of grass right? If we have 10 inches of grass and it's 300 pounds per acre inch, we have 3,000 pounds of grass. We subtract half of that to account for our animals only eating half and leaving the rest for the bugs. We get 1,500 pounds of dry matter forage per acre available for grazing. So from here, you can see that it's a very simple thing. Right now we simply, match them up. We make that division, divide 1650, the herd requirement, by 1,500, the forage available for grazing, and we get 1.1, or a little more than 1 acre. So what that means is that one acre will feed those 50 cows for 1 day, right? That's all that they'll need for that 1 day, while leaving, remember, they're going to be leaving half of that plant matter behind for photosynthesis and feeding soil biology. Let's go to the next slide, please. So in order to calculate the number of paddocks that you might need, it's just a matter of dividing your rest period by the number of days in the grazing period. So if we assume that we have a rest period of 40 days and we have a 1 day grazing period, we get 41 paddocks. 40 divided by 1 plus 1, and that plus 1 is added in there to it's added into the calculation to account for the paddock that the animals are on at the beginning of the rotation. So 40 divided by 1 plus 1. If you had 2 herds, it would be 40 divided by 1 plus 2, right? And that would give you the number of paddocks you need. So for our hypothetical herd of 50 cows, weighing a total of 5,500,000 pounds, 41 paddocks of 1.1 acres each would be a good starting point for the grazing season. But what I want to point out is it's not particularly useful or necessary to lay all those paddocks out at once and construct them. It might be better to just make those paddocks as you go, especially with electrified polywire and fiberglass posts. You can section them off as you need. This allows you to adjust and adapt based on your observation. You go out there, you see that maybe for 1 day you didn't give them enough. The next rotation, you make the paddock a little bit bigger, right? And it just makes it a lot easier, and it allows you to adapt a lot easier as you go. So you can adjust as you go, adjust as the forage recovers, but you know that you'll likely need no less than around 40 so acres for this herd for the grazing rotation, if everything goes right, right? So of course you're going to have to be thinking in terms of what if it doesn't rain? What if we need to increase, the paddock size? What if I have to keep animals on longer if it's not raining to slow down the rotation? And these types of things are the types of things that's going to be going on in your mind as you're managing your herd. Let's go on to the next one, please. Okay, so this is my last slide, and I'm just going to say a word about rangeland here. I got this graph here from Karen Launchbaugh, and she has 3 basic considerations for determining stocking on rangeland, and I liked it, so that's why I keep these. Her number 1 thing is, and I think everybody can appreciate this, do not be overly optimistic about the prospects of rain. That's why whenever I said you'll need 45 acres for this herd, for this season of rotations, you might want to double that, right? Or triple it, just to be sure, because you don't know about your prospects for rain. You'll need to have a way to evaluate and remember your year's production from last year, so that you can monitor and so that you can know, and you have a good starting place whenever you have spring turnout, about how much land and how big the paddocks need to be for your first time in. And also, as Justin was talking about, recognize the signs of overgrazing. Overgrazing can mean different things in different places, but it all, as Justin said, focuses on not allowing the grass and the forages enough time to recover. We'll calculate the usable forage and the forage demand, just as we did in our recent exercise. But it's important to remember, on arid and semi-arid rangeland, your recovery period is going to need to be much longer than in higher rainfall areas. You're going to take no more than half of the available growing forage during the season, and ensure rest periods are long enough for that full recovery. In annual precipitation zones of less than around 14 inches, rest periods of a year are not out of the question. In where I lived in Montana, we got 8 inches of annual precip, and a year was definitely, sometimes not even long enough. Grazing on upland dryland sites, it necessitates adaptive management and lots of observation. Take a look, if you have native range, take a look at the native plants on those upland sites if you have the opportunity. Some of them, like blue bunch wheatgrass, little blue stem, they're large statured. They can handle several bites from an animal in one grazing event, but other grasses like sandbird bluegrass or Idaho fescue or black grama, they're much smaller, and one bite is all it takes to reduce that plant to stubble. So cattle can graze severely, right? And so especially if you have these small statured plants, don't get caught up too much on how much they take off. Just strive for around 50% and allow for regrowth. The reason is rest periods is what's key. The key to the short duration grazing periods on rangeland, are long rest periods. I wrote about Cooper Hibbert of Sieben Livestock Company in Montana in one of my articles, and he grazes 800 to 1,000 cows without the calves on winter paddocks that are anywhere from 6 to 20 acres in size. He moves them daily, and he's in a 16-inch annual precipitation zone. In the summer, he grazes 1,250 cow-calf pairs on 60 to 400 acre paddocks for 2 to 8 days before they're moved to the next paddock. He's been able to increase his carrying capacity of their pastures due to this kind of management. And he's also put his calving dates in May and June, which aligns with calving and forage production. And what that has done is allowed him to graze his aged cows year round, right? I'd like to see what's happening this year with the drought that Linda's having, right? I'm sure that he's had to adapt. And that's what we do with drought. That's what we do with any type of disturbance. And that's it. It's 7:33. And I think that I'm done. But I wonder if, wow, there looks like there was lots of stuff going on in the chat. And Linda, I bet you, Linda Coffey and Linda Poole were probably answering those questions. I'm so happy. Is there anything that stands out here, Justin? Any questions that people might have?
I've been monitoring the chat here, Lee.
Good.
And so far, I haven't seen any more major questions come up that need to be addressed.
I'm so glad you guys were available to handle questions as they came in. I love doing teamwork like this. So Linda says that Cooper's been doing a series of workshops this winter. He's thriving even with drought, right? So that picture's still up. That picture's still up on the screen right there of his cows moving to fresh pasture, right? And in a 14-inch precip zone, if that doesn't really, set the bar, right? I don't know what does. If you can do it there, you can do it anywhere. Also, think of the pasture, the fence line contrast that Linda Poole gave me to show you guys as well. That's just an incredible testament to 15 years of hard management, making hard decisions, when to graze and when not to, right? Especially in these brittle zones that are less humid, where we have longer regrowth periods. So it's 7:34. I'm going to go ahead here and kind of wrap this up. I really appreciate everybody contributing and asking questions and giving comments. Please know that we will be getting resource lists and our slides with our notes to you tomorrow. It may be tomorrow afternoon. I'll do my best to get that to you as quick as I can. And then be ready, because next time we're going to be talking about animals 2 weeks from tonight. And so I'm really looking forward to that. We'll talk about animal nutrition. We'll talk about animal movements. We'll talk about some things people are doing to make this kind of system work. And with that, is there anything else we need to?
Yeah. We would just have to do the evaluation.
Oh, that's right. See, I got it. Please, let's do an evaluation. For those of you that are still here, and if you don't mind, we do have a session evaluation. And thank you, Carlos, for keeping me honest about this because I would have gotten in trouble. So if you don't mind, just letting us know how we did, because what this does, of course, is we take this serious. We try to make our programs meet your needs. So if you don't mind doing that, I really appreciate that. So we have 100% participated. Very cool. We can go ahead and end that poll and we'll go ahead and close out today. But for those who are still with us and paying attention, really appreciate it. You'll get some resources tomorrow. Thank you, Justin, for that incredible first session. I'm glad we have notes, otherwise I would have been writing so fast. Thank you, Linda Poole, Linda Coffey, for participating and helping out on the chat. And I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Wish everyone well. Have a good spring season. Hope everything works well for you. Keep in touch with us if you need anything, you want to talk, talk about your operation, and we will see you in 2 weeks at our next session on animals. Thanks, everybody.